Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zapansi, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. From the time he was a teenager, Jeremy Bryan Jones had let his violent passions run wild, attacking, raping, and mutilating. Then in Mobile County, Alabama, Jones' rampage was stopped, but no one knew how many bodies were in his past. Convicted and sentenced to die for the brutal murder of Lisa Nichols, an Alabama mother of 2 children, Jones shocked authorities with the story of his life and his claims of snuffing out over a dozen victims in 13 years. But was he telling the truth, or was he simply taunting his captors? Detectives from across the South scrambled to prove Jones's claims. At every turn, the man dubbed the Redneck Ted Bundy made a mockery of investigators, the courts, and the media. In the end, he would be convicted of 3 murders, but investigations into the horrifying crimes attributed to him still continue. Now, for the first time, the definitive story is told about a psychopath who enjoyed confessing almost as much as he enjoyed killing. Bloodlust, Killing Was His Pleasure, by journalist and author Sheila Johnson, my special guest this evening. Thank you very much for joining us on the program, Sheila Johnson.
Well, thank you. Very glad to be here.
Oh, thank you very much. It's our pleasure. Now, first of all the cases you could have chosen, and I know you've got some work in your past, what made you decide to write about this case in particular?
Well, I didn't really know about this case initially. My publisher at Pinnacle True Crime called and asked me to look into it and see if I'd be interested in doing a book, since I was the closest writer geographically to the place where the murder took place and where Jones had been jailed. And once I looked into it, I was totally hooked. I was on the very opposite end of the state from Mobile, where he was arrested. I was up in the north end of Alabama instead of down on the coast. And since the distance there, I hadn't heard anything about the case, but I was just immediately started gathering information as soon as I saw what was involved with it. And I didn't have any idea at the time just how much information there was going to be, and it was scattered all across the Southeast and Midwest, and as time passed, it just kept on growing.
Now, this Bloodlust is set in Alabama, but like you had mentioned, sort of bordering states that this whole story takes place. Now, what is the city of Mobile and an area like, and how big is Mobile for those people that don't really know what we're talking about? Describe the communities where this story is set.
Okay, it's Mobile, and it's one of the 5 largest cities in the state. It's a port city down on the Gulf. Okay. But the murder took place in a rural area north of the city, and Jones seemed to prefer to live and work in the more rural areas. He was just not a city boy. He's from Oklahoma, and he liked to be in places where he could sort of ingratiate himself to his employers and co-workers and try to impress everybody and be the good guy, and also where he could get out at night and troll for hookups at the smaller local bars and restaurants. And city women, didn't really go for his line as much as the more country girl types did. So his only venture into the big cities was when he made a trip to New Orleans, which resulted in the murder of a prostitute there, and when he would occasionally go into Atlanta to pick up prostitutes whenever he lived in Georgia.
Okay, now you've got right into Jeremy Bryan Jones here, but we have a different name for him. So explain that's a very fascinating story because it's so important. Just tell us who Jeremy Bryan Jones is first, and then we can get into the rest. Go back into the background as much as you have found out in your book, and tell us who Jeremy Bryan Jones was. What was his character like?
Well, there's not much information available about his early childhood and background at that time, but he came from a very lower-class family that there was a lot of turbulence, drinking and drugs and things of that nature involved. And his mother had some pretty serious drinking and drug issues, too, for which she was arrested on one occasion. And he was none of his family was very educated, but he always had the ability to sort of talk his way out of trouble and charm himself into anything that he wanted to gain entry to. And he had a pretty bad temper to go along with his charm and his conceit also. He thought very highly of himself even from a young age. But when his temper got the best of him, well, the first incident on his record of any kind of trouble was a schoolyard fight when he was just a little boy. And when the mother of the boy that he was fighting with showed up to pick her son up from school and saw him and Jones tied up out in the dirt in the schoolyard, she rushed out to try to break things up. And he turned on her and knocked her down to the ground, and him just a small boy. So that was the first thing on his record, and it was sort of an indication of things to come. Sure. And he was a big favorite with the mothers of the girls that he dated in high school or was friends with, because he was like the Eddie Haskell of criminals, right. I guess you could say. Sure. And they all liked him. He was the boy all hoped that their daughters would end up marrying, which, looking back now, I'm sure they feel differently. And he started experimenting with drugs in high school and started to show a pretty dark side there, and eventually worked his way around to some sexual assaults and attempted rapes and things of that nature that sent him to court.
What type of drugs was he doing, and maybe tell us the nature or the extent, basically, of those sexual assaults? What was involved early on? And you say these are some of his first criminal charges, and you say, you're talking about the schoolyard fight being an indication. Tell us about the extent of those sexual assaults, and tell us what happened as a result of those.
Well, the sexual assaults, I think, were primarily brought about by meth use. He was very much into crystal meth from a pretty early time there. That was his drug of choice right from the beginning. Okay. And there's not too many details on record about those assaults because both he and the girls involved were still juveniles at that time. Okay. So we can't learn very much about that, except that one of the girls said that he threatened her with a pistol, and the other girl, made a few other similar claims. Right. And because of those two incidents, he went into a program that they had in effect at the time, sort of a rehabilitation program. Right. And he was required to go to therapy, and it was a residence-type situation. And he, on very many occasions, would get mad and disrupt the proceedings and storm out of his group sessions and things of that nature. So he was working his way up to a lot of problems. And then when he got out of that situation, he tried a couple of other incidents and got arrested for those and then failed to show up. So he was wanted on failure to appear. So you say in the book he becomes, in essence, a fugitive at that point. Mm-hmm. Right. That's when after he completed this treatment program that obviously did no good, then he went back out, reoffended, and then failed to appear, and that's when he started looking for a way out of trouble so that he wouldn't get arrested on those charges. And what was his solution for not being captured again and returned to the prison to face some time for these charges? Well, his mother really helped him out of that situation. She ran into a fellow one night in a bar, obviously pretty drunk, drunker than she was, because she could still out-talk him at that stage. And she convinced him that her poor boy was about to get railroaded by the law and sent to prison for something he didn't do. And she claimed that this man volunteered his Social Security and driver's license information, everything of that nature. I think more likely she stole it from him while he was drunk. Right. Well, Jones took all that information that Mama had secured for him and hopped a bus to Alabama, and once he got down here, he had a very easy time getting new allegedly replacement ID with the Social Security number and name and driver's license number and birth date that he now had, and he just very easily slipped into that identity and remained John Paul Chapman for quite some time. He was no longer Jeremy Bryan Jones then, and in his mind and everybody else's that knew him, that he met, all the people he worked with, women he dated, everybody that knew him from that day forward knew him as John Paul Chapman.
Yeah, he essentially reinvented himself. The other part of his personality was that he was a drifter, and you talk about him securing work in different areas or having the premise for being in the area working, and you include the story of Hurricane Ivan in with the story because it's just happens to be that was the threat in that area at that time. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about what type of work that John Paul Chapman chose and seemed to be a convenient reason for him being traveling around and not staying put in one area.
Well, he was a construction worker and had evidently had enough experience in enough different construction fields that he could get work very easily. And when he first came to Alabama, he got to work with a man named Mark Bentley and worked with him a while. Then he went over into Georgia. He liked to do hurricane and tornado cleanup. He was real fond of doing that type of work because it kept him moving around and it paid very well. So he went over to Georgia and worked a while over there, a pretty good while, because he committed several murders over that way, or claimed to have committed several murders. Know for sure that he did a couple. But that was why he liked to move around, so he could kind of follow storms. And when he saw Hurricane Ivan was about to come in and hit the Mobile area where Bentley lived, he immediately decided that he would go down there and see if he could secure a job with him once again. And he had been living with a woman for 18 months over in Georgia named Vicki Freeman, and he told Vicki that he would go down there and get work and then find him a place and she could come and join him. And so she thought she was due to be joining him, and then all of a sudden she learned when somebody knocked on her door in Georgia that he was in jail for murder in Alabama, and he was not even who he had claimed to be for the past 18 months. So that was a rude awakening for her.
Okay, now let's go back to just a little bit here so our audience doesn't get confused at all. Now, you talk about him being in two areas, and with a gentleman in Georgia, if I'm not correct, just correct me, and a gentleman he had met through just sort of casual circumstances, and the person had said, if you're ever in Georgia, come stay with me, and certainly he took him up on that offer, a person named McIntosh in Georgia. And the other person that he befriended was this person, as you had mentioned, named Mark Bentley, a very important character as well. Now, tell us about Lisa Nichols, who Lisa Nichols is in this story, and how the two met, Jeremy Jones and Lisa Nichols.
Well, Lisa was a very well-liked, wonderful person from all I've been able to gather, who has, like you mentioned, the two daughters. They're two grown daughters, and they had children of their own. And Lisa was a grandmother, and you would never have known it by looking at her, because Lisa looked every bit, the peer of her own daughters. They were. Right. She was just very youthful and attractive person, well loved in the neighborhood and the community. She worked in a grocery store, and she was divorced and had a very cordial relationship with her former husband. I think she must have had cordial relationships with everybody she'd ever met, because she was so well loved. And she kept in constant touch with her daughters and all of her other family members. And Lisa lived next to Mark Bentley in a trailer park there north of Mobile. She was his next-door neighbor. And she had left her home the night before the storm was to hit to go and ride the storm out with one of her daughter's family in a motel farther up to the north where they'd be more out of the way of the projected path of the storm.
Okay.
And then when she returned home to check for damage, Jones had shown up next door looking for work again with Mark Bentley, and he noticed her and sort of homed in on her and had commented to his friend, Bentley's cousin, that he would be quite interested in making time with her if the opportunity arose. And the cousin said, well, you better leave her alone. You know, she's way out of your league. And by that time, Jones was so high on meth and several other drugs that he and the cousin had been indulging in while Bentley and his wife were away, that just sort of made him that much more determined to go next door and see about her.
Now, you say that the cousin, and we're talking probably about Scooter Coleman,
yes,
said, hey, listen, this woman is out of your league. And what you mean by this league is that Scooter Coleman and definitely Mark Bentley and Steve and Mr. McIntosh in Georgia, all of these people recognized very quickly that they had a person that was unreliable and definitely had a major crystal meth or major drug problem living in their midst, which created all kinds of problems. So he wasn't the most trusted person. So when you say that, I just wanted to make sure people understand, when you say out of his league, he really meant that they were friends with this lady, as everyone was, Lisa Nichols, and they definitely didn't think this person was, that they should introduce or encourage any kind of relationship.
Oh, absolutely. That's the case. And Lisa did not date people. You know, she concentrated on work and her family, and she was not out looking for a good time in that sense at all, and would never have had anything to do with somebody like Jones.
Now, what was the circumstances with Lisa Nichols being found? What happened next? Why were they in the company of each other? Does anyone know? Tell us a little bit about what the circumstances of the next few hours. What happened?
Well, apparently while Lisa was gone staying at the motel with her daughter's family, Jones broke in next door and stole a pistol. And then that night after Lisa had returned home, then as soon as things kind of quietened down in the neighborhood, Jones left the trailer and went next door and pretty much forced his way into the trailer and started making advances, and Lisa naturally ordered him out, and he got really angry, and he said that at the time that he was higher than he'd ever been in his life. So he raped her, then he shot her, he put her body in the bathtub and attempted to set it on fire, trying to burn the trailer down and destroy all the evidence. And the trailer was shut up so tight that none of the smoke escaped, and nobody in the neighborhood could tell that there had been a fire inside. And when she didn't answer her phone at all the following day, the two daughters came that night to check on her and walked in with flashlights and found the trailer full of smoke and their mother's body in the bathtub. And that was an absolutely horrifying experience for them. They were very traumatized by it. And I can't even imagine what it would have been like for them to walk in and find something like that. And, of course, there was a big cry was set up, and all the neighbors from all around came running to try to help and see what was the matter, except for Jones. And he sat right there next door watching TV while everybody else was outside seeing what happened, because he knew what had happened.
Did the police also find evidence that she was sexually violated as well?
Oh, yes. She was first and then shot and put in the bathtub.
Okay.
And he evidently just went into a frenzy.
Now, you say that clearly that there's an investigation looking for a killer. Tell us what happens next. How long does it take for them to identify the killer, Jeremy Bryan Jones?
Well, they didn't arrest him as Jeremy Bryan Jones because, as luck would have it, his false ID held for quite some time after he was arrested. But when the murder was discovered, several of the other neighbors reported that there was a new person in the area and described the vehicle that he was in, and Mark Bentley, his former employer, was able to give him his name and Social Security number and birth date of the man that he knew as John Paul Chapman.
Right.
And he had disappeared from Bentley's home the day after the murder, and so they immediately had the prime suspect. And 4 days after the murder, one of the lead investigators got a phone call from Chapman and managed to keep him on the phone long enough for the call to be traced, and another one of the investigators went to the location and found him and arrested him right there, still on the phone with the other officer. So he was immediately arrested and charged in the murder.
Now let's just go back just a wee bit before we get to this next and very exciting part of your story. He was arrested. You tell in your book that he was arrested a couple other times in between a long period of over a period of 3 years, and his fingerprints obviously would be taken at that time. And despite those fingerprints being entered into the FBI's database that would do comparative studies between fingerprints, the names were never associated. Just tell us a little bit about that, and then go on to the next, what happened next.
Well, nobody has ever been able to pin down exactly how that happened, but when he was arrested over in Georgia, he would be run with his fingerprints and the John Paul Chapman identity, and it would come up that way. There was some kind of a glitch in the system, and nobody ever figured out exactly how it happened. But they have certainly been trying to guard against that since that time, because during the time he was being arrested and then released, or arrested and kept for a fairly short time, there were 3 other murders that probably would not have happened if they had caught that fingerprint mistake initially.
Right.
But it was a FBI situation, and they went jumping through hoops trying to cover all their bases, explaining how it might have happened, and safeguarding that it wouldn't happen again. Right.
Now, Chapman, you say, is located after they traced where he's making a phone call from, and now he's in police custody. How long does it take the police to find out that he is not Chapman, and then what happens?
Well, as soon as they had him in custody, they suspected from the look of the murder scene and how things were done that he had killed before, and they immediately sent all sorts of information out all over the country to departments just literally from coast to coast with all his information on there, John Paul Chapman and his name and numbers and picture and the whole 9 yards. And they got a message back from a prison up in Oklahoma that said, you don't have John Paul Chapman. We don't know who you do have, but we've got John Paul Chapman up here.
Okay.
And he had been in prison since very shortly after he gave up his identity to Jones's mother in the bar.
Incredible.
And one of the clerks at the prison happened to see the information that came through on the murder and Jeremy Bryan Jones, and recognized that who they had in Mobile was not John Paul Chapman, and that was the first anybody knew of it. They were just flabbergasted. Wow. And it was some time after that they found out his real identity, because they noticed he was calling a number in Miami, Oklahoma very often to a woman named Jean Beard. And they called the Miami Police Department and asked them what connection there could be, and they said, well, we don't know. So she's got a son that disappeared from up here a few years back that we had warrants on, named Jeremy Bryan Jones. And that's when they determined who it was that they actually had in jail. He
Wow.
had made his false identity hold for that long.
That's incredible.
Yeah, he got away with it.
Yeah, you think it's incredible when they had two apparent John Chapmans in jail at the same time and no one noticed.
Yeah, that I guess they weren't. The Georgia authorities were not checking like the Oklahoma prison system and not running enough information through on a federal level for anything to turn up. So,
oh sure,
it was everybody sort of dropped the ball all the way around on those.
Yes. Now, who are the central characters in enacting a confession from Jeremy Bryan Jones, and what does he say, and when does he finally get around to saying some of this stuff? Tell us about that. Tell us about that fascinating story.
Well, at first he denied everything, and then he would tell just a little bit of detail here and there, but still deny everything. And it wasn't long before he learned that every time they brought him out for a long interview session, that he might get to order some special food or get to make an extra phone call or get some kind of privilege that he enjoyed. So he tried to drag things out as long as he could.
Sure.
But one of the most telling things that he did was to place a call to Mark Bentley from the jail and literally confessed to him about the whole murder, admit that he had done it and how and why and how terribly sorry he was and how he regretted it, and that of course was recorded. So he admitted himself at that point that he had done it. And then later on, when the detectives started confronting him with more and more evidence, he started crying big crocodile tears and he didn't want to die. He was afraid of dying, and he just loved life too much, and he didn't want to get executed. Well, one of the detectives reminded him that his victim had loved life too, just as much as he did. So,
right.
So he just kind of gradually started leaking out information because he saw that the more he dropped, the more he would get out of it, and all of his claims were just thoroughly investigated, and some of the time there's no indication at all that he had been involved in any way. And he just told such a good, plausible, believable story that people would travel from all over the country to come and interview him from the various departments where he was claiming, that he had killed somebody in their jurisdiction. It just turned into a circus. And he loved giving phone interviews to the media. He loved for people to come there and talk to him, various TV stations and newspapers. He literally ate it up and always had a story to tell and claim to make, and it was the attention. He just got addicted to the attention and could not stop talking, even though everybody was advising him not to.
Sure, certainly. Now, you talk about some of the confessions he makes, and obviously you have alluded to that some of these things are exaggerations or outright lies. Nothing can be confirmed. But you do have in your book, you mentioned some names, Justin Hutchings, Kathy Freeman, Danny Freeman. You mentioned some people in your book, and there obviously is a good reason why you're mentioning. There are some likely victims of this man, and explain that whole story and why you're so certain, or why other people are so certain that he is charged for more than one murder, more than Lisa Nichols. So tell us a little bit about that. Who are these people that they think he killed?
Okay, well, the two people that they know he killed are the little girl over in Georgia, Amanda Greenwell, and Tina Mayberry is a very likely person that he killed, but there's been no proof on that. Now, he was indicted for Amanda's murder, and Catherine Collins, a New Orleans prostitute, he's been officially charged in that case. But, for instance, the Tina Mayberry case, she was a girl that was a regular at the same bar and restaurant that was his favorite place to go there in Georgia where he lived. And she was murdered during a Halloween costume party and just left literally lying on the front step of the bar whenever she went outside to her car and somebody stabbed her to death. And he's always been the prime suspect in that murder. But There's just that last little piece of evidence lacking in that one. And another case that I still sort of believe he may have been guilty of, Patrice Endress was a Georgia hairdresser that was kidnapped from her salon, and her body was found months later behind a church. And Jones had claimed that he had done that and gave all sorts of information about where the body could be found, and nothing ever quite panned out. But I still think it's possible he could have been given false information along with his confession that might possibly have been true. So all of those were really checked out thoroughly, and in the 3 cases that he was charged with, they had plenty of positive proof and evidence, but in so many others that he confessed to, he might have learned enough from newspaper and TV accounts or overheard things in jail and gotten enough to confess and then earn himself a pizza or a steak or a lobster or some free phone calls. So there's so many things that he may have done and so many that he may have not done that it's just nearly impossible to sort them out. But there's a huge list of people that he confessed to while he was in jail in order to get favors.
Right. Now, you mentioned that Amanda Greenwell, after she disappeared, that Chapman was actually, or Jeremy Jones, was questioned about her death.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about that he was close enough to that investigation that he was also questioned?
Well, he lived there in the same trailer park with Amanda and her family, and as he had in several other instances, he showed just a little too much interest and acted a little bit suspicious enough to get people's attention, and that's how the authorities would end up coming to question him on these. You know, he just tipped his hand sometimes by showing too much attention to young girls. I know when he was living there, I believe it was in the McIntosh household, he showed a little too much attention to the teenage daughter and literally started stalking her and tried to break in the house on her several times. So, you know, he was known for that sort of behavior.
Now, of all the murders that he confessed to, how many did the police hone in and say these could be good possibilities based on the information that he gave us, the police?
Well, they did that on almost all of them, but then when they would check them out in detail, they'd never be able to find enough proof or never be able to locate bodies where he said they'd been left. And, you know, they always tried. Everything he said seemed plausible at first, and then when they dig into it, they might find it was coming up a little short or the timeline might not work out just right. But for instance, the girl that he claimed was his first victim, it was an Oklahoma newlywed. Her name was Jennifer Judd, and she was just a gorgeous girl, and I think had only been married a week, and he murdered her in her apartment. And he confessed to that, but he's never been charged because there was any evidence of any kind other than what he had claimed. There was no physical evidence ever found that could link him in any way to that one, but he claimed that she was his first victim. And when he claimed that he'd killed a great number of prostitutes in Mobile and in Metro Atlanta, they could never find any corroboration there, and no bodies were found in the swamps where he said that he had dumped them, and nobody in particular came up missing in the kind of numbers that he was claiming.
Now, in his confession, you know, it's various responses from various types of killers, I guess at different levels or different levels of honesty. How did he describe his victims? How callous was he in the description of the victim? Did he do the typical trying to rationalize why some of these people were killed? I'm saying in the confession itself.
Sometimes he would. Sometimes he'd be all remorseful and shed a tear or two, and sometimes he was just very matter of fact about it. And in the case of the New Orleans prostitute, they were questioning him about her murder, and one of the officers from New Orleans that had come over said that it just gave him cold chills when they asked him why he had killed this woman. Said a change just came over Jones's face, and he sort of growled out, because the bitch deserved it. And, you know, sometimes he would be that way, and sometimes he'd be very matter-of-fact, and other times he'd say, oh, it was just business. He was sent to murder somebody because they had cheated somebody else on a drug deal. You know, he always had some reason. But it changed from one case to the next.
Now, you spoke of the confession that police got that was, I guess, damaging at court, or at trial, potentially. This is talking about Lisa Nichols and his involvement with the death. Tell us about that confession. I'm very interested to see what he actually said. Obviously, he looked up to Mark Bentley. Mark Bentley took him under his wing. Tell us about that confession and how damaging specifically it was in some of the details he gave to Mark Bentley in that confession over the telephone.
Well, Mark Bentley was the one that he told that at the time he did that, he was higher than he had ever been in his life.
Right.
And he said he didn't know why he did it. It just happened, and he regretted it so much, and he was so sorry for the family and sorry because it was a friend of Mark's, and Mark was having none of that. He didn't believe that for a minute. And Jones, you know, kept admitting a little more and more to him, and it all boiled down to the fact that he was so high on crystal meth at the time that he was just totally out of control and said he didn't know what he was doing. I think he was pretty well aware of what he was doing, but he didn't have any conscience or any hesitation to do any of it. But he pretty much outlined. Well, one thing that he did, though, he tried to turn it around on Scooter Coleman and say that Scooter was involved, and
oh, really?
Tried to convince Mark that, you know, Scooter was in on the plan. And then later on, after Scooter was killed in a freak electrical accident, then he went just full bore at the time of his trial trying to turn it around onto Scooter. But
wow.
that blame the dead guy tactic didn't work in that particular case.
Did he talk about any sort of rationalization or justification for having shot her? And did he mention anything about the sexual aspect of it at all, ever, to Mark Bentley?
I don't believe he rationalized it in any way. I think he may have told Mark that she turned him down, and he got mad when he tried to. But then he told other people later on that it had been consensual, and she had asked him to come over and bring her some drugs, and his story changed constantly. But as far as rationalizing that, I don't think he was ever able to come up with any kind of an explanation that he thought Mark Bentley would even come near to buying. Because, I mean, what he did was so just beyond the pale that he tried to get Mark not to hold him as responsible as he thought he was going to hold him. And that, you know, like I said, it just didn't work. Mark didn't want any part of it.
Now, tell us about the ensuing trial. Is there many motions put forward? Is there a huge delay between the time of the arrest and the trial? And tell us about whether Mark Bentley and then McIntosh, Mr. McIntosh from Georgia, his other landlord, if they participated in the trial at all. Tell us about the trial, please.
Well, the trial took on some really political aspects before it ever even got started. The Mobile County District Attorney had stalled around trying to get more confessions out of Jones when it was obvious that he was making quite a bit of them up, and he kept wanting to put the trial off and postpone any action being taken. And Lisa Nichols' family appealed to Alabama's Attorney General, and he personally took over the prosecution of the case, took the case away from the Mobile County District Attorney and tried the case himself with his own staff, which doesn't happen very often, and
right.
that set up a feud that's running hot and heavy to this day between those two men because of that. And the DA ran against the Attorney General in the last election and got soundly defeated. So, like I say, the feud is still ongoing, which started because of that. Now, when they got to the trial, Mark Bentley did testify, and they played his entire taped conversation for the jury, and I believe quite a few of the people from Georgia had come over to testify also that had worked with him over there or had offered him a place to stay until they were forced to put him out because of his drug use and things of that nature. But the trial just turned into an absolute circus. There were so much media there, and Jones would turn around in his seat and smile for the cameras out in the hallway and just pay more attention to what was going on in that respect than he did to what was happening in the courtroom. But
so he was really enjoying himself, was he?
He loved it. He loved the attention. He never acted like he was on trial for his life the whole time. He was enjoying the attention so much, and he was constantly talking to the press and making statements and giving interviews and talking to these investigators without his attorney being present. And the attorney was just horrified. The man was completely out of control, and there was nothing his attorney could do about it. And he was constantly making his own statements, refuting whatever Jones had said that day to whoever he had said it to. And you could tell that he wished he had certainly never gotten involved in that one. And on one instance, he was trying to get the judge to arrange for a psychiatric evaluation, and this was, allegedly to help Jones. Well, Jones rears up in his seat and bellows out, "I ain't crazy," to the courtroom. Mm-hmm. And his lawyer trying to prove that he is, so he might use an insanity defense. Well, the attorney, Mr. Habib Yazdi, jumped up out of his seat and socked Jones back down into his chair and put his hand over his mouth to shut him up. So that's how out of control he was. Right.
Now, what was you mentioned now that the state, and he's tried in Alabama, obviously, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have the death penalty there. Is the death penalty also available in Georgia as well?
I'm not sure if it is at this time or not. It has been in the past. I'm not sure if it is now or not, but he's highly unlikely to ever be tried for the murder in Georgia or the murder in Louisiana, either one, even though he's been charged. I don't think he'll ever come to trial because it's such an expensive proposition to try somebody, and he's already been, he's on death row in Alabama, so as long as that's the case, I don't think they would ever attempt to try him in those states unless for some reason he got his sentence overthrown here, which is highly unlikely to ever happen.
I was just wondering, just something to think about. It's not much of a question, but just often some of these guys that are facing a death penalty in one state will often confess to crimes where there is no death penalty, and realizing that there's not much that anyone can do, even if they were convicted of it anyway. Getting back to the trial, what did they use as a defense?
Well,
or attempt to use?
Attempt is the word. It was so far-fetched, it just went beyond the pale here a lot of the time that he claimed that Jones was confessing to so many murders because he had been given medication in the jail that caused him to talk uncontrollably, and that most of the details of those confessions was coming from stories that was told by drug dealers in the jail with him. And he also was claiming his defense was that Lisa had had consensual sex with him and things got too rough. And during the preliminary hearing, Yazdi made the absolutely incredible statement that he didn't think it was that much of a crime to shoot a dead person, saying that Lisa had already died of a drug overdose before Jones shot her, which was not true. Yazdi said, well, it's not that much of a crime to shoot a dead person. it's now a thing instead of a person, and that sent Lisa's whole family just running from the courtroom in horror. That was to have heard a statement like that made under those circumstances. That was just, Yazdi was pretty good at statements of that sort anyway.
Sure.
And when he first took over the defense, he told the media that Jones was just a highly intelligent person, and then a few days later he'd be claiming that he was in no way mentally competent to talk to the authorities without an attorney present. And pretty soon he was saying that he didn't need to be talking to the media or anybody else because he was just totally, mentally unfit. And this was a man that he had initially claimed was such a stand-up guy that was so intelligent that he just couldn't possibly have murdered anybody. And
right.
When Jones finally made it onto the witness stand, which he was just dying to do, he couldn't hardly wait to get up there. And he had the audience literally laughing out loud because he announced what a good-looking man that he thought he was and how he had a way with lemons and he could talk the pants off of a nun, and bragged about how whenever he wanted special food or privileges, all he had to do was make what he called the magic phone call to the investigators, and they immediately had him escorted into the interview room and given him whatever he wanted. And he just generally did everything that his lawyer had told him not to do and got up there and performed like a circus monkey on the stand, and it was a total laughingstock.
What was his explanation for why you told us part of it. What was his explanation for having to shoot Lisa Nichols?
Well,
what was the purpose of it?
I think he just had the stolen gun and shot her to keep her from telling anybody that he had broken in and raped her. So he had committed that, and then he killed her to keep from talking. He shot her to keep from talking, and then he tried to burn the body to cover up evidence of her having been shot and raped.
No, what I meant was, what was his explanation on the stand for, he already said, she died from a drug overdose, so it wasn't a big deal. I didn't think it was a big deal to shoot her, but what?
Yeah, why he said that he had shot her after she had died of a drug overdose.
Right.
Well, he said at one point, I don't recall if he said this on the stand or not, but at one point he made the statement that he shot her to keep it from looking like he had brought drugs to her. He wanted to make it look like somebody had broken in and shot her, and not that he had given her drugs and she'd died of an overdose. So that was supposedly to cover up the overdose, which didn't happen.
I see. Oh, so his claim that it was a drug overdose was totally disputed by the coroner or the medical examiner.
Oh, absolutely. There was not a trace of any kind of drug or anything else in Lisa's system. So that was a total fabrication.
Yeah, and obviously we won't go into too much. It doesn't, this guy doesn't dignify too much to go through whether there was any mitigating circumstances to prevent him from getting the death penalty. He certainly got the death penalty. The jury decided pretty quickly. What was the situation?
Well, it took them 2 hours to find him guilty, and it only took them 45 minutes to decide on the death penalty. So it was pretty much a cut and dried thing. It was very fast, and there were no mitigating circumstances of any kind that were ever mentioned.
Was Lisa Nichols' family, surviving members of the victim's family, did they attend court? Oh,
yes, they attended every day. Her daughters and quite a few of her other relatives were always there. And the father of Amanda Greenwell came from Georgia to attend the trial, and the husband of Patrice Endress came over, and he attended the trial. So, there were other victims' families there in addition to Lisa's family. But they were there, and after the trial, Lisa's daughters told the press that they just could not be any more grateful to the Mobile investigators and to the Attorney General's office for the work that they had done, because the case was handled very well by everybody involved in that respect. Where they all fumbled was allowing him to play them like fiddles on all these confessions to get his extra treats and privileges.
Now, if you've answered this, I apologize. I just want to make sure that I understand this. I'm just curious. Now, officially or unofficially, Tina Mayberry, Amanda Greenwell, and Patricia Endres are the people that he is suspected of killing, likely, women that disappeared. Am I correct?
Yes, but there's another huge list besides those. There's so many other people that he was suspected of besides them. I mean, the list just went on and on and on in several states.
How many would you say, not to pin you down or anything, but I mean, no one's going to sue you, but how many do you think he likely, more than likely killed with fairly solid evidence that of comparative type of crimes and victims and geography? How many do you really think likely that he killed?
Well, I think that it's likely that he killed Jennifer Judd, who he said was his first victim. I think it's also likely that he killed a couple in Oklahoma, Danny and Kathy Freeman, and kidnapped their teenage daughter, Ashley, and her friend, Laura Bible, and then murdered them somewhere. Their bodies have never been found, and there was no proof of any other kind to ever substantiate that, but I have a gut feeling that he was responsible for them. And it's also possible that another couple involved in the drug underworld there in Oklahoma, Danny Oakley and Doris Harris, were murdered and their trailer was burned, just like the Freeman murdered when their trailer was set on. And another couple out in Oklahoma was murdered under similar circumstances. There was a girl in Atmore, Alabama, close to Mobile, that disappeared from her home under circumstances similar to Lisa's. She's never been found. Now, it's very possible that he could have done some or all of those murders. It's possible that he might have done none of them. I think he's responsible for some of those. And also Justin Hutchins, the young man you referred to, by a drug overdose. I think that Jones was responsible for that because he was well acquainted with him and claimed responsibility. Right.
Yeah, with a combination of similar characteristics and MO and maybe even signature to a certain degree, or at least victim characteristics, it's very likely. Because especially when you said earlier on that when authorities first looked at this, given the particulars of Lisa Nichols' murder, am I not correct in saying that they felt that they immediately sent out the particulars to other bordering states, but they really did feel that this was not from a perpetrator that was on his first offense?
That's right. The detectives said at the time that as soon as they looked at the scene, they immediately had a feeling that this was not his first crime of the sort, and that's why they sent all the details and descriptions out to so many different places, and that's why they started having hits from all around over the country from some of these similar crimes. They thought for a time that he might be responsible for some of the crimes that were attributed to the fellow that they called the truck stop killer, and he killed quite a few, and Jones confessed some of those and then, gave some details about some others. There were several unidentified bodies that they thought, with the location and evidence of how they were killed, that might have been Jones' responsibility. Now, the lady in New Orleans, the prostitute that was murdered there, it took a while to identify her, and they had to send her skull to have her face reconstructed, and then sent photographs of that around and had them on the news. And one of her friends happened to see the picture of the reconstruction and recognized it as being her, and she had been missing at that time for several months. And then they started investigating that and discovered that Jones was responsible for that murder.
Wow. So where is, just quickly, where is Jeremy Bryan Jones right now? Where is he being held in death row?
He's at Holman Prison here in Alabama. And he's having himself a fine old time. He's working all of the internet death row pen pal websites, and just on one of them he made the statement that all the different wonderful things that he enjoyed doing. He liked long walks, and he liked to hunt and fish, and he liked NASCAR. And then he made the statement that he liked Mardi Gras, which I found pretty, I don't know, that's where Catherine Collins was murdered, was during Mardi Gras. And for him to make a statement like that on his website, I thought was pretty strange.
Yeah, incredible.
But he's on death row and working it for all he's worth.
Yeah, enjoying his infamy.
That's it. He enjoys that. He would do anything, anyway, anyhow, to get attention. And he's, thanks to a lot of people that I tend to personally think of as bleeding hearts, he's getting a lot of attention from those death row websites.
Yeah, that's incredible.
They all want to save the poor, misunderstood boy.
Yeah, I know. We got a lot of that in Canada, a hell of a lot more than you've got. It's incredible here. You wouldn't believe. Well, we don't have too much time for that. We have a few minutes, though. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other books that you have and some of the other projects that you have coming up, and how people can contact you if you have a website or a blog, or just give us a little bit of information about new projects and some of the other books that you have already out in print.
Okay, my first book was about one of the cases that I worked when I was a reporter. A fellow was about a 400-pound cannibal that carted his dead girlfriend's body all over the Southeast, strapped into the passenger seat of his car. Wow. And he finally had a wreck up here in the county where I was working, and that's how they discovered that. That was a hard book to write, though, because there was no trial, there was no search for the killer. I mean, the killer was right there, and they had him, right from the get-go. But it was a very interesting story, and I did manage to get a book out of it, which was my first one. And my second book was also from this area. It concerned a man that murdered his wife and mother-in-law for insurance money, and then stabbed them with Native American spears and knives and things to make it look like a cult killing of some kind. And he would have gotten away with that, except he just couldn't keep his mouth shut, and he had to brag to somebody about what he had done, which happens pretty often, I think. Mm-hmm. And my third book was the Jones book. My fourth book, which will be out in August, is I'm really conflicted about this book. I have never written about somebody that received a big sentence for anything that I believed was truly innocent of what they were convicted of. Right. But the woman that has been sent to spend her life in prison for murdering her ex-husband's current wife, I think she's innocent. I think someone else committed the murder. There was another person with her at the time, and I think that person is the real murderer. And I'm really conflicted about it. Everybody that has read that manuscript says that they immediately come to the same conclusion when they're just presented with the straight facts. Right. So I would sincerely like to see this woman get another trial. I hope that can happen, because I think she should have gotten the short sentence, and the person that's walking free now should be the one in prison for life.
Well, good for you. I'm glad you're taking sort of an activist role. I think there obviously are people fighting for people to get retrialed, but I think the fastest and one of the most effective ways is to get the media involved, write a book about it. It's surprising what kind of attention then comes to that same story. So it's good for you, and good luck with that.
Well, I certainly hope it works in this case. I would like to sit out on my back porch and drink coffee with this lady instead of having her sitting down there in prison for the rest of her life. I feel a lot of empathy for her.
Well, that's great. I want to thank you very much, Sheila, for a very informative interview about your great book, Bloodlust. I want to thank you. I want to thank you very much, and have yourself a good evening.
Well, thank you.
And best of luck with the new project. What is the name of the new project, the projected name of the latest project? Do you have a name for it yet, title for it?
The new book is Blood Ambush.
Blood Ambush. Okay, we'll be looking for that and other titles. with Sheila Johnson. Thank you very much, Sheila. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. You've been listening to the program True Murder with your host, Dan Zupansky, the most shocking killers in true crime history. Have a good evening. Good night.